on the brain. And you can see some pictures here of dissected brains. All right, so the big three parts, and there's parts within these we'll go over, are the cerebrum. As you can see, by far, it's this whole upper region here is the biggest part of the brain. The brain stem, which will connect to this vertebral column, the vertebrae, and then the cerebellum. We'll go over what all those parts are and do. So we already said the cerebrum is the biggest part. So you can see here the large part. It's the wrinkly big part. Basically, if you draw a brain, this is probably the only part you're drawing. And it's responsible for your higher mental functions. So things like solving problems, thinking. You use this part a lot of the school day. The cerebellum, remember it's highlighted here. So if we're using our terms here, this would be posterior and inferior to the cerebrum. And the cerebellum is responsible for balance and coordination. White matter within it gives it a tree-like appearance, and they call that tree-like appearance that you see down here really well arbor vitae. If you know any Latin at all, Arbor Day even is tree day, so arbor means tree, and vitae means like life, so the tree of life they call it because it looks like a tree in our brain. And the third big part is the brainstem, which regulates our visceral functions, visceral meaning our internal organs. So this is in the autonomic system, the automatic system, remember? So things like breathing and heart pumping and digestion, all this stuff that happens and is essential for life, but you don't have to do or regulate or think about, is happening due to the brainstem. So we're going to have to be able to label a picture like this, labeling those parts and some others. So we'll throw it here for you now. And this will be in your note guide here in a second. But the parts that you will not see on a test. The skull, I mean, we know it. We've already had it on our bone test. The meninges will not be on there. But this hypothalamus and pituitary, I'll be honest, they probably won't guarantee it. But those are going to be talked about in our next unit with the endocrine system. But everything over here is fair game that we'll be responsible for. So go ahead and pause while you put this into your notes. All right, so more parts of the brain. Those are the big regions of the brain. Within those, we have some things called the cerebral hemispheres. A hemisphere, if you know anything about geography, is just like a half. And this is the left and right side of the brain. So if we'd cut the brain right down the middle, splitting it in left and right, a sagittal plane, if you remember all that, along the sagittal suture of the skull. Anyway, cerebral hemispheres are separated by something called the corpus callosum, and its job is to connect so the two sides of the brains can communicate with each other. You see it really pronounced here. And this is a brain that's been cut in half sagittally or transverse. And we see that corpus callosum is pretty prominent, and that's what connects the two sides, two hemispheres of the brain. Another picture here. You can kind of see that same shape here. Corpus callosum. The optic chiasma is how I learned it. Sometimes you'll hear it referred to the optic tract now. It's called the optic nerves cross over each other. So you can see here, this would be the right eye, and this is the optic nerve coming out of it, but it crosses over into the left side of the brain. Left eye here, the optic nerve from it crosses over, and that optic tract chiasma is kind of the crossover. But something, if you didn't realize, the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body, and vice versa. Brain convolutions. Convolutions is a fancy way of saying the wrinkles and grooves of the cerebellum. So the folds and the grooves that are created. So the deep grooves are called fissures. These two won't be on the test, but we should be aware of them. A shallow or smaller groove is called the sulcus, and a bump would be a gyrus. And each of those, remember, shallow grooves, the sulcuses, has a name based upon its location in the brain. So frontal sulcus is in the front of the brain. Superior temporal gyrus is in the temporal region, and an inferior temporal gyrus, well, we know inferior means below, so we're not going to have to know any of these names, don't worry. But you can kind of, if you did see one in the future, you can kind of have a guess of where it is at just by knowing the bones of the skull, the parts of the brain, and our lovely anatomical terms like inferior, superior, and that sort of thing. Go ahead and pause while you put this into your notes. All right, so the lobes of the brain should be pretty easy for us if we remember our bones of the skull. So remember, this would be our anterior side of the brain, front. This would be our posterior back. And we have the frontal plate of the skull. Well, that's where the frontal lobe is of the brain. The temporal lobe is underneath the temporal bone. The parietal lobe's under the parietal bone, and the occipital is under the occipital bone. So those should be no problem. Here's what they do. Frontal lobe is thinking, our executive functions. Parietal lobe is where our perception is, so our senses send information to the parietal lobe, and also involved in math. Occipital, remember we said on the occipital bone, if you've ever hit the back of your head on something hard enough and like you see black or you see stars, it's because that part of the brain affects your vision. And then your temporal lobe affects your memory and your language. All right, so fissures, they're going to separate parts of the brain. And if you look, well, you don't see the longitudinal fissure real good here. But we do see the transverse fissure, and we know the word transverse, so this shouldn't be a big deal. This big, deep space here in between the cerebrum and the cerebellum, that would be our transverse fissure. And a longitudinal fissure, kind of see a little of it here, separating our left and right side of the brain. So go ahead and put this into your notes. Pause while you get it all in there. All right, so moving on to the brainstem. Brainstem is going to consist of, you can see it kind of in here, the thalamus and hypothalamus we won't talk much about until we get to the endocrine system. Same with pituitary. Our midbrain is there, so are our pons and our medulla oblongata. So these are brain parts. These are actually endocrine glands found in the brains. So the brain parts, the midbrain, is for our visual reflexes. Things like blinking. Yes, if somebody like jabs at your eye, you're going to blink and close your eyes on purpose, so the midbrain's taking care of that. But also, I mean, when you have a staring contest, eventually one of you blinks because it is necessary. So that's happening by the control of the midbrain as well. And even just eye movements, so looking left, right, up and down, things that you can control, also taken care of in the midbrain. The pons are where the part of the brain where they relay sensory information. So if you remember from the first unit, we said we have a sense. So you touch something hot, and that, well, yeah, not super hot. So we're not talking about a reflex alert. You touch something hot, your sensory neuron would send an impulse, a nerve impulse, and it would be sent to your pons, because that's where they're going to relay that sensory information before it sends another nerve impulse back to your muscles telling you, hey, get off this hot thing. The medulla is the part of your brain responsible for your heart, so pumping the heart, which is autonomic respiration, breathing, blood pressure, things that you don't consciously think of, but absolutely essential for life. Good pause while you get those functions down. Sorry, I might have gone too quick, but make sure you pause. All right, so parts of the central brain here that you need. This, the diencephalon, just consists of these two parts, which again won't be on this test, the hypothalamus and thalamus, but the other parts will. So make sure, like, this is a study slide. Once you start practicing these, you can go here to see if you got them right, and here would be the answer key. So the big three for our test would be the three on the right: midbrain, pons, and medulla. These three would be on our next unit of endocrine system. Wait a minute, you do need these in your notes, so I'll pause here, my mistake. Just some more different views, so nothing here, nothing different, but you can see here we have our hypothalamus, won't be on our test, our optic chiasma. Pituitary gland is split up into two parts because they do different things. Anterior, we should know, is closer to the front of the brain, posterior to the back. Same thing, a couple more terms. Here is that corpus callosum that connects the left and right side. Our midbrain here. Our pons. Our medulla. Our cerebellum. And the whole big part, our cerebrum. This is an actual brain. So what it really looks like, not the diagrams. Same, another just different view of these things, showing 3 major endocrine glands and that good old corpus callosum connecting the left and right side of the brains. And then our midbrain, pons, and medulla. Last part of our second set of notes, the limbic system. This is part of our brain that's responsible for behavior and emotional response. And one of those parts of this brain, you're not going to have to label it because it's kind of small and hard to find here, but is the amygdala. And this part of the brain is responsible for storing memories that are associated with emotion. So things that made you really happy or sad or mad. Also, it's associated with fear response and aggression. So if you'd like this, there's a little connection here. You can get a hold of me. Let me know if you want access to this. You can't do it on the video, but you would be able to see it on the slideshow itself. Also part of the limbic system is the hippocampus. It's for storage and retrieval of memories. And they say it kind of looks like a seahorse. You can see the head here, the tail wrapped around. I never really made that association, but it might help you remember where the hippocampus is, and it helps store and retrieve memories that are not associated with emotion, just memories like, hey, I need to remember what the hippocampus is, and that would actually be stored in your hippocampus. Some more views of the brain. Again here, got in this color our midbrain. If we look over here, we can see it here. Our cerebellum, real life cerebellum, big old cerebrum here and here, and then our corpus callosum, which you can't see in this picture. This is an MRI. Sees a little more clearly. You can really see the arbor vitae here. The tree of life, remember? And last thing you need for notes. So pause here, and once you're done, you are done.